Today, let's talk about the kingdom fungus. Fungal diversity in nature and associated with humans is pretty diverse. Now, in general, what we think about with fungus is typically negative, right? But what I want you to start thinking about is, rather than just thinking about it as being a fungus, think about it as being a decomposer, meaning that it has a very important role in the environment for recycling nutrients and other components that are necessary for organisms in the environment to live on. The other thing we have to think about is, without decomposers, we'd be polluted with decaying organisms and dead things, and they just would never break down. So we have to think about them as having a very strong positive role in the environment. At this point, we've identified about 77,000 different species of fungus. So very, very diverse. Now, we've talked about chytrids. We talked about them with protists. We said they are most likely the fungal-like protist that would have given rise to all of our different fungal diversity that we see. Now, the club fungus is one that's probably most familiar to you, but we've talked before about mycorrhizae, so those fungal associations are critical as well, particularly for plant development. In general, we look at fungus as being multicellular. There is one exception that we think about a lot, which is yeast. This is a single-celled organism. But all of them are what we consider absorptive heterotrophs in some way. So what does this mean? Break it down. Heterotroph means to eat, right? What does absorptive mean? Well, it's kind of to suck up, right? Okay. So most of them are releasing digestive enzymes to the environment. The enzymes break things down and then are reabsorbed by the fungus. This is something we call external digestion. Okay? There are other types of feeding mechanisms for the fungus. There are a couple of predatory fungi. I have one here for you that has surrounded a small worm, will hold on to that worm, essentially has lassoed it, and will break it down very, very slowly and digest the nutrients it needs. Not very pleasant, but certainly effective, right? The majority of the biomass of a fungus is actually below ground. Remember, biomass is carbon. So when we look at a fungus and we say, oh, look at that mushroom, the mushroom is actually just the reproductive structure. This is only present to produce spores and the next generation. The majority of the fungus and all of the digestive types of things that are going on and the decomposition that is going on is actually because of this below ground biomass. In nature, we can see it not just on the ground, of course. Fungus is everywhere. It's one of the leading causes of agricultural losses is because of fungus. Huge amounts of crops are lost every year because of it. But we can also look at it as being negative in our homes. We see mildew and mold associated with our basements often. This in humans is something known as ringworm. It is not a worm at all. It's actually a fungus. Okay, so if you have ringworm, you would actually take antifungal medications. It's not a worm, I promise. You're not being invaded. But we also look at benefits. Fungus doesn't always have to be negative. So we have a lot of drugs that are based in molds and fungus. Penicillin is a primary one. Statins, which are cholesterol-lowering drugs, are huge on the market now in pharmaceuticals, all of which are based in fungus. Foods, some of you enjoy the moldy cheeses. Some of you enjoy beer and wine and bread and pastries. Anything that requires yeast is going to be based in a mold and a fungus. So when we look at penicillin, it was actually discovered pure on dumb luck because look at here. So this is a plate covered in bacteria. This streaking is bacteria. And this is a blob of mold growing. But you see around that blob of mold, there's no bacteria. the mold is literally killing the bacteria. This is pretty cool. Penicillin is an awesome antibiotic, but the problem is, as we get smarter and smarter bacteria, more and more evolved bacteria, penicillin's not working for everything anymore, so we've got to find new antibiotics. We'll talk about that more later. If you actually took that slice of bread at home that's growing a little bit too much mold in your kitchen and looked at it up close, you'd see these nice long filamentous structures and then these balls. These balls are covered in spores, so they're like a mushroom. Okay, so their job is reproduction, and they release spores to spread that bread mold to the rest of your loaf of bread and potentially to the rest of your kitchen if you're not careful. Now, when the spores are produced, they're released from the fungus and either return to the bread or return to the ground. And what it's hoping for is a nice moist environment. So in order for these little spores to open up and release what we call hyphae, we need them to be in a moist environment. These hyphae are going to be the reproductive structures. Now, we normally think male-female. We don't go that far in fungus. Think plus-minus. Okay, we talk about them as being plus-minus strains. And when they match up and come together, if they are opposite strains, they actually will fuse the cells together like a normal egg and sperm would to form a zygote. The weird part here is, you see these dots? The dots are nuclei. They're two different colors for a reason. They want you to keep track of the fact that in these cells, we actually form something known as a heterokaryotic or a dikaryotic cell. Di meaning two, hetero meaning different, right? That means they have two nuclei. This is weird. When we formed a zygote before, the nuclei would simply fuse and we'd have 2N chromosomes inside that nucleus. Nada. Here we have haploid cells because they have not fused the nuclei, and they're going to grow this great big mushroom structure, and only after that occurs will the nuclei fuse. Now we finally get fused nuclei that will produce more spores. It's a weird life cycle, huh? But it works very well for keeping genetic diversity as high as possible, because really these plus-minus strains, we would like to be coming from two different fungus, not from the same one, right? So when we look at different categories of fungus, we can think about the normal ones that we're used to, club fungus that we eat and so on, yeast that we look at in the environment. But we also want to think about the relationships that fungus has with other organisms. These are probably the most important. So lichens are actually an association of a fungus and an algae. Algae photosynthesize, right? And fungus decompose. So you put them together and you have a terrific relationship. So the fungus are literally going to cradle the algae and hold them up into the air. Why would they do that? Why would the fungus hold this algae up into the air? Well, there's sunshine, right? If the algae is going to photosynthesize, produce carbon in the form of sugars, right, that the fungus can use, it's going to support those algae. What do you think the fungus is giving to the algae, other than a place to live? Mycorrhizae we've talked about before, this association of a fungus and a plant root. We think about 90% of the fungus on the planet have this association. Critical for increasing the surface area of those plant roots for absorption and also to supply nutrients needed by the plant. Do you remember what the plant gives the fungus?